Hi. Welcome to the very first NYU Game Center lecture series talk that's being held in this new building, 370J. So yeah, we're extremely excited. We are going to, eventually, there's another space that's going to come online downstairs, which is an auditorium that's even a little bit bigger. And so eventually we'll start using that. But we're going to be up in this space for the next couple of talks that we gave. We have some great talks lined up later in the season. We have Winnie Song, who is the most recent full-time faculty member to join the NYU Game Center. So we're very excited about that. She's going to be giving a talk about her work. And Bonnie Ruberg is later this season, who has a new book coming out, Video Games Have Always Been Queer. So that's cool, and she's going to be giving a talk. And tonight, we're extremely excited to have Marie Foulston. I think that is, I'm thrilled that Marie is here. Before I introduce her, let me just quickly thank the sponsors that help make the Game Center lecture series possible. The generous folks at Take-Two, at Fresh Planet, at DOTS, and Empire State Development. So a round of applause for the sponsors, please. Thank you for helping make the lecture series possible. Marie is a curator of video games and an event planner, a community organizer. She is the co-founder of Wild Rumpus, which is the coolest party in video games, with a possible exception of No Quarter, so maybe. She's also the curator for digital at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where she was the lead curator on an exhibit called Videogames, Design, Disrupt, and Play. And this was an exhibit which came out last year and is widely recognized as being one of the most influential and important video game shows that's ever been in a museum. Incredibly well designed, thoughtful, and important. As someone who cares a lot about the project of not just participating in game culture and contributing to game culture, but also as someone who kind of feels this responsibility of helping the world at large, who isn't part of this community, understand what's happening in games and why it's important and interesting. I think that the work that Marie is doing as a curator is extremely valuable and important. Please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Marie Foulston.
Thank you. The microphone's on. I'm going to unplug this power cable because I don't trust myself to not trip over it. So let's all keep our fingers crossed that we've got enough juice in the laptop to see us through. So thank you so much for that introduction. It always still surprises me and means a lot to have so many people come out to hear talks about video game curation, because there's part of me that's still, I guess, sort of from a few years ago that has this anxiety that it's like, I'm sorry, everybody, we're not here to talk about how games get made, that is not, that's not my profession. But it's great to have so many people here to come out and hear a talk about curating video games, but also to see like a few faces in the audience who I know are also curators and event organizers. So it means a lot to have other people who are working in the same space sort of come and be in the same room. So if anybody's in any doubt about who's talking, here's a giant picture of myself. In fact, here's not just one, here's two. Two projector screens so you can see me in stereoscope as well. So my name is Murray, and I work as a curator of video games, or I call myself sort of a playful curator. And just to, I guess, sort of paraphrase that there's a whole range of different ways that we can think about curation in video games, that we can think about that in terms of conservation, in terms of archives, in terms of historians, and we can think about that in terms of collections curators. But the work that I do is not necessarily focused around those areas of curation. Instead, the area that I focus on is specifically around exhibition and display and interpretation. And it's not to say that those other components aren't things that I have an awareness of, that they all sort of are interconnected, and they're all sort of critical parts of thinking about how we can curate and how we build sort of a cultural ecosystem and history of the medium. So, as Frank mentioned, this is my background in curation, that this is sort of the origins that I came from, and it's perhaps sort of a lot more DIY and a little bit sort of rough around the edges than the work that I do at the V&A. And so this is some photographs and documentation from my time sort of working as co-founder and co-curator with the UK collective Wild Rumpus. And that is something that was heavily inspired by the New York collective Baby Castles. And so it means a lot as well to be talking about and presenting this work in a city which had such an influential community for me on my own practice. So this was work which was really creating sort of playful arcade club nights and trying to create different cultural spaces and different cultural environments for video games to exist within. And I think largely I can describe sort of the motivation of my history into getting into curating video games as basically a response to places such as this. That going back sort of about 10 or so years in the UK, that predominantly the main spaces that we had publicly to engage with video games were traditionally sort of large expo spaces. And I just find them found them such brutal, unplayful spaces that also to me didn't necessarily convey or communicate the side of video games that I was interested in. And so that's where sort of Wild Rumpus came from. But today I currently work at this place, which is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. If you're not familiar, the V&A is a very large international museum. It is one which focuses predominantly on design and design process, although it's a museum that also engages with photography, with architecture and performance. And so I'm currently in New York, and I've been in New York since May this year, to undertake a research fellowship also with the Cooper Hewitt, which is the Smithsonian's Design Museum. And that fellowship is really, again, sort of a continuation of my work at the V&A to think about the way in which design institutions and major design institutions can engage with video games. So the majority of the work that I'm going to talk to you about this evening is in relation to this project, Video Games Design, Play, Disrupt, which that was a very sort of good effort at getting the title correct, but sadly sort of we made it quite complicated that most people get it in the wrong order. But so this was an exhibition at the V&A that ran from September 2018 through to February 2019. The exhibition at the V&A or at South Kensington has closed, but the exhibition is traveling internationally, so who knows where in the world it's going to pop up to next. It's just finished its time in Scotland, and it's off overseas somewhere else, which I'm not allowed to say where just yet. But just as a quick note as well, before I go into talking about the exhibition, is just to state that an exhibition such as this, and it's great to have, and it's been a huge privilege to have worked as the lead curator on the exhibition, but no exhibition is the work of one person alone. It was a mammoth project that sort of consumed sort of 4 years in total of my life, and was contributed to and worked on by hundreds of people. And these are just a small sort of handful of the key names of people who worked on the exhibition alongside us. So alongside me was the research curator Christian Foulston, who was the second member of the curatorial team, and other people I would especially like to call out were Samantha King, Annabella Martinez, Ruth Law, and Tessa Pierce, who were our managers. So those are really our producers or our project managers, who are an absolute powerhouse of a team at the V&A in making sure that projects and exhibitions at this scale can happen. So yeah, so why video games? Why in a museum? And this is normally the slide at which I'm normally lobbying to an audience about sort of the cultural validity of video games, which I don't think this is the room that I need to do that to. But instead, what I am going to say is that 2.2 billion people in the world today are estimated to play video games, that it's a quarter of the world's population. This is the League of Legends World Finals in 2017 at the Beijing Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium. This is an arena with a capacity of 80,000, and it's watched by 60 million online. And did you know that games earn more than film and music combined? And blah, 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 blah. These are numbers. So this is something that sort of frustrated me and frustrates, I think, a lot of people sort of working culturally around video games, is that we often see sometimes these headlines sort of announcing that this game has made X billion in X number of days. Maybe now video games will be considered sort of equal culturally alongside film, alongside music. And I don't think so. I don't think that's enough, because these numbers are great at telling us sort of the view of video games from afar. They're great at telling us sort of how many people and how much of an impact this medium has, which ultimately is the strong justification for why it is so critical for us culturally to have an understanding of why video games are so important. This is a medium that touches so many people in the world that we need to be considerate of the cultural literacy that we foster around this medium, but also the different spaces that we can have for this work to exist in. And it also reminds me of, again, sort of these numbers, I think, speak of video games very much as an industry. And that's not to deny that that's not a critical part of games, but there's something that Robert Yang said in an article which sort of talked about the fact that it feels like we're often trying to reverse engineer an art form out of an industry. And to do that, we need to build up this cultural ecosystem, this cultural landscape around video games. And to me, that is what is important about having critical platforms to be able to discuss and exhibit that work. I love this quote. Games are still magical. It's like they're made by elves. You turn on the screen and it's just this world that exists on TV. I think you gain something by not knowing how they're made. No. This was a quote from Dan Houser in an article in GQ talking about Red Dead Redemption 2. And he's talking about, obviously, that mystery that sort of can be created by sort of unawareness or a lack of literacy about the way that video games or equally sort of digital design or technology exists today. And to me, it's sort of a quote that talks about like this conflation that we often have between technology and magic. And it sort of also reminds me of that quote that sometimes, I don't know who it's attributed to or falsely attributed to, that any advancement in technology or any technological advancement that's sort of advanced enough is indistinguishable from magic, which, yes, there could be great wonder and magic there, but I think there's also so much danger in that statement that to me, this is something that when we're equivalent, like with literally sort of dehumanizing games designers and developers to thinking of them as this sort of anonymous elves. And so there's something incredibly dehumanizing about this quote and about this consideration of thinking it's great if we don't know how games are made. But also I'm assuming that the majority of people in this room have sort of a very strong literacy or understanding of the way that games are made. And I'm afraid to tell you that that means that you just enjoy video games less. Just as much as a musician enjoys music less because they understand how it's made, or a filmmaker doesn't appreciate films as much. So to me this again talks about sort of a myth or a sort of perspective that, yes, you can have opinions, but there can also be opinions that I disagree with, and this is one that I strongly disagree with. And again, to me, it's why it's really important that the work of an institution or a design institution can help fill the vacuum that is created by sort of sentiments such as this. So coming back to the exhibition, so the thesis for the exhibition, just to give you a bit of an overview, was that we wanted to present a contemporary perspective of video games. And so when we say contemporary, we're specifically looking at a period from the mid-2000s through to the present day. The reason why we're looking at that specific period is that in the mid-2000s, we have this whole host of technological catalysts, from smartphone to broadband to social media, all of which has had a radical impact on the way that games are designed, the way that they're discussed and the way that they're played. And for us, that was the starting point that we wanted to take for the exhibition. And I think a lot of times our assumptions about video game exhibitions is that they're going to be a historical retrospective. And so in some way, this exhibition was a response to that and a desire to move the conversation forwards. It was still an incredibly broad survey show that if we're looking at all sort of groundbreaking design from the mid-2000s to the present day, that's still a very big field. But it was an attempt to sort of move the conversation forwards and begin to narrow down a lens through which we look at video games. And just to sort of note as well that this being an exhibition that took place in a design museum, that is very much the lens through which that we were looking at games, was design and design process. But it is not to say that we can't consider games through other lenses or from other perspectives. And equally, the fact that this was a major cultural institution means that we had ambitions of reaching a broad audience, which obviously impacts the way in which we approach the exhibition. Now, this next slide was a video which we spent about 15 minutes before you came into the auditorium trying to make play, and it did not want to play. It's a nice little zippy video which gives you an overview of what the exhibition looked like to a jazzy soundtrack, but I'm afraid you're not going to appreciate that, so you instead have to appreciate our 2 security guards standing outside the entrance for the private view. So I'll try and paint sort of a picture, or at least a moving picture, through some slides and an explanation. So this is a broad overview of the exhibition of a floor plan. So the exhibition consisted of 3 key sections. So the first section of the exhibition was called New Designers. This was where we were seeking to look at video games through perhaps sort of a slightly more traditional lens of looking at games as design objects and looking to understand their design process. And in this space, we had 8 contemporary games, all the way from big AAA titles down to independent games. It was not an attempt to create or to exhibit a survey of the field from that period. Instead, we had to make some hard decisions about which games we would bring into that space. And for me, sort of something that was really important was to not necessarily focus on sort of breadth of games that we could bring into the space, but instead to have focus on just a handful to be able to really consider them in depth. So the second section of the exhibition was Disruptors, and this was a space where we're looking at the social and political conversations that were being had both about video games but also through video games. It was without doubt the hardest space in the exhibition to conceive of. And the last section is one which sort of is a section of 2 halves. So this was where we pivoted to look at video games or video game design from the design story and perspective of the players and the player communities. The first half of that was looking at players online, which was a space where we were looking at mass online player communities and sort of understanding that the way many people engage with video games today transcends the role of the designer. And so we looked at 4 key games in this space and looked at 4 different perspectives of player creativity. And so the example that you can see up on screen here was looking at fan art and cosplay, specifically within the video game Overwatch. And we narrowed that down to be a focus just on Diva. And so this was a film that brought together artifacts which were all completely sourced from online communities. So everything that went into this film was sort of an artifact or an object that was sourced from different digital communities online. And the very last section of the exhibition was Players Offline, which was still keeping with this idea of looking at player communities and looking at sort of the creative role of player communities, but was looking at that instead of looking at the sort of the mass, the online and the popular. It was looking at the niche, the DIY and the offline, and specifically looking at sort of the rise of the DIY arcade scene and the alt control scheme, sort of designers who are creating works that really embody that sense of sort of physicality. And also for me, it sort of comes full cycle that this is a space that obviously is closest to my heart as well in regards to the games that were exhibited. So one of the things that we were really seeking to do with this exhibition as well, so not just with the content, not just with this focus on looking at the contemporary, that one of the things that we wanted to do as well was try to explore different curatorial languages for video games. And so these are 2 sort of past exhibitions, and obviously these are exhibitions which have done fundamental work at bringing video games into large cultural institutions. So they obviously have done this incredibly sort of important foundational work, but what I'm sort of bringing up here is sort of the marketing materials that they have for those exhibitions. And I don't know if you can see sort of the 2 sentences that I have highlighted or underlined in their descriptions. is the way in which they sort of consider themselves, which is that for both of these exhibitions, there is a key focus on how many playable games there are in those exhibitions. And this is obviously not the only way that major museums have exhibited video games, but it's the predominant way, and it's the predominant understanding and I think expectation, both of institutions, but potentially also the assumption of audiences, is that, great, an exhibition on video games, this is going to be a retrospective history, and it's going to be a great place where we can just play everything, and we're going to just drop the kids off. Yeah, so the thing that I wanted to talk through today was, I guess, sort of trying to think of why that is perhaps sort of a complicated way, or it doesn't give us thinking of games purely as playable objects or playable artifacts within an exhibition context doesn't necessarily provide us with all of the different sort of curatorial approaches that we might want to take to video games, dependent on what the lens is or the approach that we want to take for the medium. So in terms of interactivity and allowing people to play in museums, what are the key issues with that? Well, first of all, we have an issue of time, that video games are a time-bound medium, that this is something where it might, say, for some video games, take you upwards of sort of 30 hours to be able to really experience or reveal that object as a design object within, with your engagement with it. So within an exhibition where you're likely to spend sort of an hour or 2 hours, how much time do you have to experience the game? And especially if we're putting hundreds in there, like how many of those are you going to have a meaningful experience with to understand them as design objects? Also access. How many people can play a video game at any one time? So if it takes one person to play one game, what does that mean for the people who aren't able to interact? Like, how do we create a meaningful experience for other people within that space? There's also literacy. That video game controllers can be, or video games, not just the controllers, but also even just the mechanics and the way to play video games, is a language that's evolved, and how many people are confident and comfortable in picking up a contemporary video game controller and engaging with that. And if you're not, how does that object or how does that thing reveal itself to you? Are you prevented from engaging with it? And I'd also say that context or concept of literacy goes both ways, because not only if you are unfamiliar with that do you potentially have issues with engaging with it, but if you're very familiar with a game and you come into a space and you're giving the exact same experience of playing it that you had at home, what else do you gain from your engagement with that in a museum or in a exhibition space? How do we get you to look at that work differently? That simply just the nature of that game within an exhibition to me is not enough. And then lastly, just a note on pressure, the pressure of public performance, that I'm somebody who feels comfortable and happy having a games controller in my hand, but I do not like playing in public. I don't like people watching me play. I'm still burdened by this sense that there is a right or wrong way to play video games. You can be good or bad at them. And so there's a whole sort of set of nested reasons why actually bringing playable games into an exhibition context can be a complicated way to think of them in terms of exhibiting. But the key issue here, I'd say, is really one of intent, of what do you intend to present to visitors, or to intend to present to an audience, to have them understand about that object? Why have you brought it into this space? What is the message that you're seeking for them to take away from it? And for me, thinking purely of the playable object does not always undertake that. And I just want to put an end note on there of saying it's not to say that I'm completely against exhibiting playable works, that hopefully my past sort of curatorial work with Wild Rumpus sort of showcases that I am very interested in finding playable ways of bringing playful experiences into public spaces. But for me, I also want to explore what other curatorial languages, what other ways we can get people to understand video games in public spaces. And so I wanted to talk through sort of one case study today, and it's a case study from the first section in the exhibition, New Designers. And so as I said before, the intent of this section is getting people to look at video games as design objects and getting them to also understand their design process. There's no way within this space that we had the capacity to present the full breadth of the design process or design intent within a video game. So we had to make a very specific selection for each game that was brought in. Why are we bringing it into this section? What is important about this game? What is the design story that we're really seeking to convey about this? And this is if people have seen me speak about this exhibition before, this is normally the point where you're probably expecting me to go off and talk about Journey, which is normally the case study that I talk through at this point. And this is a talk which I've given at GDC, so it's one which talks about this aspect of new designers, which is predominantly focused on the artifacts and materials that sort of illuminate the design process of video games. If that's a talk that you're interested in seeing, then the URL is up here, which I don't expect anybody to write down or remember. So if you just remember to go to the GDC vault and put my name in or the exhibition title, you should be able to find that. It's also, I think, in a pinned tweet at the top of my Twitter profile. So that is not what I wanted to talk through today, and I wanted to hopefully have time to talk about a different case study. And this is the first time that I think I've really given this talk in public, so you have to bear with me that I managed to get through and remember all of the points that I want to make in the correct order. But to me, so, oh yeah, videos aren't playing. So the game instead that I wanted to talk about today was the video game Bloodborne from Software. So the intention for us when we brought this into the exhibition was really sort of how do we communicate to audiences that for us what was valuable, what was impactful and important about this work was the sheer sort of complexity and skill that went into designing the combat of this game, and also the skill that it takes for players or demands of players to be able to play through this work. It was also important for us to bring in sort of large-scale AAA games into the exhibition, but often we wanted to be able to bring in games which might sort of surprise broader audiences who aren't necessarily literate or familiar with this game. And so it's a game that I think if you're not familiar with it, that can actually on first glance kind of look a little bit cliched. And so how do we get sort of audiences who are familiar with this title and also those who aren't to think about it or consider it from a different perspective? So like Journey, we brought together this range of process material. And this was material that was sourced from software, which just brought together an idea of some of the materiality of the video of Bloodborne. It exhibited and sort of conveyed more than just sort of that idea about combat. We also looked at architecture, we looked at the composition of the music, but all of it was sort of building up to this idea of how they've created this sort of overwhelming environment and this overwhelming experience for players. And so I often talk about this as being sort of like this constellation of artifacts and objects that people are able to look towards to gain a better idea of the materiality of the medium, to be able to sort of gain back some of that humanity of the medium and to remind people, hey, it's made by people, not elves. But those constellations of objects were things that also sat around sort of a key installation. So each of the 8 video games in the exhibition, or in this section of the exhibition, also had a large-scale installation alongside them. And this was something that for us was providing this sort of key focal point to command attention within this space, that not just how do we get you to view video games from a different perspective, but how do we also create sort of this moment of spectacle and performance, that we're bringing you into a public space, we're bringing you into a museum. How do we create sort of this memorable experience that conveys and communicates something impactful? And so each of these installations that we had was sort of probably the most sort of experimental part of that section, in that for each of these games we tried and tested different approaches to opening up their design process or opening them up as design objects in a variety of different ways. And so no 2 installations were the same. And just taking a sort of a step back here, that one of the things that I wanted to just sort of highlight for me was this particular work by the artist Harun Farooqi, and it is his series Parallel 1 to 4. And this was a installation which I had a chance to see at the Whitechapel Gallery in London a few years before sort of we were curating the exhibition. And this is a series of video installations, and they're all sort of slightly different, but for me it was an incredibly sort of impactful and influential installation. And so some of the videos that you have within this display, so this is not an interactive display, this is purely a video installation. And some of the videos that you have within this piece are these videos of the artist playing through key sort of video games. So some of the ones I remember were things like sort of LA Noire or Grand Theft Auto. And some of the ways that he was creating these videos was this very intentional sort of form of play. So in one of the games, he's going in and out of a shop and sort of repeatedly sort of undertaking very sort of deliberate behaviors and very sort of unconventional player behaviors with some of the NPCs. And as he's doing this, you begin to see sort of the characters break down. You begin to see sort of where the repetitions of what they're sort of programmed to do sort of begin to play out. And it's not sort of this intentional style that you would normally presume sort of a player to undertake within a video game. In some of them as well, he's driving towards sort of an endpoint in a game. He's picked a fixed location and he's just driving through. And there's all these invisible barriers that obviously are created within the landscape or the environment to prevent that journey, to prevent sort of players from journeying that direction. And so through these different repeated behaviors within these playthroughs, what begins to happen to you as a visitor is that you begin to actually see the materiality of those works. You begin to understand sort of some aspects of the design considerations. You begin to see them as considered and designed objects. And to me, in terms of exhibitions that I've seen for video games, that this was without doubt sort of as an installation, the most informative to me and the most sort of, the one that communicated to me video games as a designed object, video games as something that's created by humans and the considerations that go into creating that. And all of that is done without me getting my hands on the controller. And I think all of this sort of comes to, for me, sort of this idea that I'm trying to, I guess, sort of explore within a lot of my work at the moment, or my research, is beginning to think about actually what are video games? And I don't mean that as in a, hey, let's all come up with a nice agreed sort of definition as to what a video game is, but I mean in terms of sort of from the lens of a design museum, or from the lens of an institution. And the way that we as museums traditionally, or design museums traditionally think of design is that there is one static object that is this authentic, singular, traditional material object. That is a gross oversimplification, but please allow me to be sort of a little bit reductive for the sake of comparisons. And so when we're trying to think of video games through that lens, thinking of, okay, if I want to exhibit this water bottle, I know that this is the thing that I'm going to display, and you as a visitor will be able to come in and appreciate that sort of within the museum space. But if the difference between that water bottle and a video game is that if nobody is there to play that video game, the video game doesn't necessarily exist, which is not true of the water bottle. And so when we think about, when museums are predominantly thinking about video games and thinking about the ways in which we can exhibit them, that we tend to, I think, over-focus on, or not over-focus, but we focus very heavily on the variables and the consideration of the video game as this sort of traditional material object. And when I say traditional, I can even be considering it as a digital object. But the creation of that video game and its existence is something that only exists in collaboration with somebody engaging with it. No two people will play a video game in the exact same way. That there is not one play or one performance of a video game. There's infinite performances of a video game. And so instead, the space that I'm interested to consider from, and I think that this example sort of talks through, is instead thinking that as institutions, if we think differently about what video games are and think about them instead potentially as performance, what space does this free up for our considerations about how we might interpret, or how we might exhibit that medium? So yeah, so what does this mean for Bloodborne? That one of the things that I think this approach about performance also challenges institutions is that traditionally when we're thinking about sort of static design, or when we're thinking about sort of traditional design, that we normally have this, again, this sort of idea that there will be sort of an authority who will help us define the authenticity of that object, that we want to, as a curator, be as hands-off as we can. We want to be able to present that object in the most authentic way. And so we will normally look towards an authority to be that person who will set the parameters for that and set the definition for that. And traditionally that might be a designer. But when it comes to digital works, is that, or when it comes to interactive objects, is that enough? If we're simply looking towards the designer as sort of part of that creator, if we're understanding the player as a co-creator of that object, what other authorities and who else do we need to go towards to consider the way in which we define that? And as I was saying before, it's also thinking, how do we get audiences both literate with that game, but also unfamiliar with that title, with that game, to consider this differently, to be able to show it from a different perspective? So within the exhibition, this was probably, it wasn't the most complicated, because I'll give that honor to EVE Online, but this was definitely one of the most complex games for us, I guess, in terms of the exhibition. And so when I said before about how long it might take to, on average, complete a video game, that yes, some we can complete in 10 seconds, but what's the average playtime for Bloodborne? And so I went to howlongtobeat.com to give me a nice average, which says that main story is about 35 hours, or if you're a completionist, it's going to take you 77.5 hours, which averages out at 48 hours. So in terms of this being a complex object and a time-bound object, this is an incredibly complex, dense story that we're trying, or design object that we're still trying to present within this space. So how do we do that? How do we reduce sort of the ability for people to see that game down to something which can sit within an exhibition space where your dwell time, the time which you will experience or spend with that object as a visitor, is not necessarily going to be averaged out at 48 hours? And so for this, the thing that we decided to focus on was understanding that, as I said, we understand that we can't necessarily look at the entirety of that work. And I think a lot of people within curatorial or within digital design talk about video games and talk about digital design objects as complex digital design or complex objects. And yes, they are complex. And as curators, that means that we do not necessarily have the ability to bring them in their entirety into an exhibition space. Instead, what we have to do is make decisions about what aspect of that work we want to consider and how we want to present it. So for Bloodborne, we had to think, okay, well, what is our intent for this game? What is it that we're seeking to present? And for us, again, it comes back to this idea of how do we communicate sort of this idea of this extreme difficulty, of this extreme skill, both of that skill in designing that, both of the designers, but also the player. And so we decided to sort of settle on a perspective of just looking at the cleric beast. And as I was saying before, in terms of authority, this was a decision that we did not come to sort of in isolation. This was something that came out of both conversations with the original designers, but also thinking about other people and other authorities that we needed to look towards to begin to understand what is important about this work. And so instead we spoke to a variety of people, academics and historians, and people who were sort of specialists within this specific game to sort of begin to ask them, like, okay, if there's one aspect of this game, if there's something in this work that's important to communicate or convey, what are ways that we can approach that? And so some of the ideas that we had originally in terms of how we would conceive of an installation or of a display for Bloodborne, or just the cleric beast, some of the original concepts we had was, can we collaborate with From Software? Can we get access to some of the design objects or the design materials that shows or begins to reveal that design process? And sadly, that was something that we were incredibly limited from, because From Software do not have that stuff archived, and it is not always in the best interest or in the interest of a large AAA studio to put resources towards finding or recreating or reaccessing old design documents for museum curators, because that tends not to be where your revenue is coming from. So we were limited in what we were able to access. But other ideas that we had for that was, okay, do we create multiple machines for many audiences to play on? If we have sort of all of these different machines where people could each sort of play and sort of fight against the cleric beast, does that begin to communicate and show people sort of that people can each get hands-on and understand sort of what's so complicated about this specific battle? But again, the same issue persists, that we don't have the ability to create a bespoke demo of that game. So the only way that we would be able to exhibit that would be to have the full playable game in its commercial release on display, which is too complicated for us to manage. We also thought about having a giant tower, sprawling tower of monitors, each playing different crowdsourced videos of different playthroughs. We thought about bringing an experienced player into the exhibition, and for the entire 6 months of the exhibition run, having them sit there and play Bloodborne. I think you know why that one didn't happen. So we sort of explored all these different ways, and one of the ideas that was sort of one of the latter ideas that we came to was thinking about showing an entire playthrough of this cleric beast boss battle. And the idea for that was to say, okay, if we have a player who is sort of somebody who's confident playing games but is perhaps not an expert at Bloodborne, and we get them to start that battle, and we're going to record them from start to finish. They're going to play through X number of different failed attempts, and eventually they'll succeed, and we'll just keep recording that from end to end, and that's what we'll display. But we didn't necessarily know what the factors were for that what if this person manages to do it like on their first go, that suddenly that kind of defeats the purpose for the exhibit, that suddenly it looks quite simple to do, but what if it also takes like 10 hours? That again, sort of, if you're coming through and you're looking at this display for sort of maybe 5-6 minutes, again, doesn't quite convey what we intend to. So instead we had to really think about how we created sort of this directed play, how we sort of were able to capture the performance of this. And so we still retained that idea of keeping sort of one version of that boss battle sequence, but instead decided to bring together sort of multiple screens. And this was one of our early sort of concepts for this. And so the idea actually, or a big part of the idea, was influenced by a video demo that is from Polygon, which is this sort of demonstration that they have of how to defeat the cleric beast. And so when you watch this video, there's sort of instructions on what your approaches should be and how you should undertake that combat. And so we sort of took that as a point of inspiration of saying, okay, how do we communicate both how do we show sort of both a successful sort of combat sequence, but also show this idea of repeated failure, that if we just show you one successful playthrough, you gain this idea that perhaps, or this mistaken idea that maybe this is something that's quite simple to do. So instead we wanted to bring in this montage of all these failed sequences. And we also had in the very early stages this idea of an attack and damage animation, which was some of the material or some of the only material that they had still available, which had been gathered for a magazine profile or coverage on Bloodborne. But yeah, and so one of the things that we felt like, and I think this was taken from that Polygon video, was that one of the things that was really critical or important for us in creating that was that it needed to be scripted, it needed to be commentated over, that actually just coming in and watching a playthrough perhaps wasn't providing you as an audience with enough interpretation about what it was that you were witnessing. But also, who do we go to and how do we record that footage? And so we reached out to Matt Lees, who is a YouTuber and also an expert in, or a very sort of keen expert and fan of Bloodborne. And he's somebody who plays sort of, or is a YouTuber, is somebody who understands sort of not just the technicality of how to record and capture content from video games, but also understands what it means to have to perform in a video game and how to undertake sort of this form of directed play. And this idea of presenting sort of playthroughs or videos of people playing is something that's not sort of unfamiliar for museums and institutions, both exhibiting and archiving both games and digital design. But one of the things I hear all too often is institutions saying, yeah, we wanted to get a recording of this, so we got our interns to do it. And I don't mean any discredit to the interns, but that performance and that capture and that style of playthrough should be something that you're considering just as strongly as you're considering the game that they're playing. That the way in which they're playing and the way in which you're presenting that is something which is equally important. So as a curator, you should really be thinking, what actually is that I'm seeking to present through this? And so Matt Lees was somebody who we were able to have conversations with and collaborate with. And what you're looking at here is the script that he wrote to annotate the playthrough before that. And so one of the things that sort of this begins to open up as well is this idea of curating more collaboratively, of thinking that actually, in order for us to capture something as curators, that we need to collaborate with people who are going to be capturing and preserving those performances. And in terms of collaboration as well, that we needed to think, how is this going to manifest within a physical space? That this is something you need to consider for all digital design objects or digital born objects, is that they don't have sort of necessarily a physical presence, that they have size and constraints and proportions that you can measure and exhibit, that you need to be working with sort of 3D designers or AV designers or encompassing those roles yourself to understand how that object and how that material is going to manifest within a public space. And so one of the concepts that our exhibition designers sort of came up with was considering sort of the environment and the landscape and the world of Bloodborne, was to look towards this idea of sort of referencing sort of this religious triptych within the display of the screens and the monitors. Oh, look, a video is playing. Hooray! It's not the most important one, but yeah. So this was sort of what some of the concept sketches of where that piece, of where that sort of installation sort of came to. And here is this going to play or is it just going to all go to black? It's just going to go to black, so we'll see if I can just capture that again for a split second. Where's the whole thing? The computer's got the little beach ball up, so we'll just look at this. Wait, there we go. Okay, stay. Good. So this is the final installation as it was realized. And so the combination of screens that we have here, so the top one is this sort of directed playthrough, which is annotated by Matt. And so this is him entering into this sequence. And what you're seeing sort of down in the bottom, this was an early concept that we had for the display, but we'd actually decided to take out in place of the design materials, but realized that actually in terms of communicating this work, that it was actually more important for us, or more sort of in tune with the whole of the installation, to present this, what's the word, synchronized video footage that was captured by Matt of his hands on the controller. Because a key part of this as well was how do we communicate as well the skill of the players in terms of playing this work. Oh well, you can all remember it from a few seconds ago. So this was his hands on the controller, and it was synchronized. So when you watch this video playthrough, you also get the synchronized view of his hands on the controller playing that. In the center was the script of the voiceover that he was providing over the top of that, because we didn't want to sort of overlay that over the game's menus, partly for sort of accessibility, or mostly for sort of accessibility issues, but also to make sure that people had sort of a full view of the game. And the last screen on the bottom left, we're still retaining this idea of these failed playthroughs. So it was this montage of a series of failed attempts at beating the cleric beast. So it was this constant repetition of the "you died" message. And so overall, this was the way that installation sort of manifested within that space. And so just going back over, I guess, sort of the ways in which this challenges institutions, that, as I was saying before, sort of video games are complicated objects, especially as playable objects, to bring into institutions. But it's not just the way that they're complicated in terms of play that they're challenging for institutions, but also this approach as well is something which I think breaks a lot of the conventions or assumptions about the way that we think about curators engaging with objects or materials within display spaces. That for one, it challenges our notion about objects and authenticity, that this is not the playable game of Bloodborne. What we would normally consider to be the object is not present here. You're not sort of witnessing that sort of in this traditional notion of an object. It's challenged our notion of authority, that this was something that was not just created with looking at or speaking to simply the designers of this work, that we were speaking to players and speaking to enthusiasts and speaking to academics about their impressions and their understanding and what they felt sort of was important about this as a design object. And I guess sort of critically also challenges our notion of a curator in terms of the fact that this is us as curators having a huge intervention into the object, that we are not standing back and trying to sort of necessarily present this sort of authentic object and having limited engagement with it. Instead, we've done an awful lot that is manipulating, taking the game away from its original context. And so ultimately, these are things which really challenge our notions about what curators should be doing within museums. And ultimately, video games are a medium which breaks in museums, but I think also that means it's an opportunity to use video games to break museums instead, and to have some fun and to be a little bit playful when we're doing that. But it's okay, because there's provenance. It's been done before. And I'll just wrap up by talking about just a couple of things. So this is something in the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is Trajan's column, and it's in our cast courts. And the cast courts are a display, an exhibition space in the V&A, and they present all of these sort of objects from around the world, different pieces of architecture and sculpture. But they're not the original objects, they're not the original artifacts. They're instead created sort of by Henry Cole's sort of very early on in the museum's history. These are casts that were taken of those objects, and the ambition in that day was sort of, you can't travel to these foreign places to experience Trajan's column from Rome, so we're gonna take a cast of it and bring it here. And so it was a way for people to be able to appreciate and to be able to view those objects in a different location. And it was dealing with the fact that there was this issue of scale, or this issue of access. That access issue was more that they're too far away for you to get to, and also too big to bring to you. But as curators, they've had to make decisions here about what is it that we're interested in presenting to the visitor? What do we want to make visible to audiences that come? And that focus is very much on the sort of physical makeup of that object, that if you go and sort of dissect these inside, it does not present the materiality of that object. It's something entirely different. And these are things which have taken on a very different sort of role within the institution over the years, that actually these artifacts or these casts are now sort of very key sort of educational objects or objects for study, because whereas the original Trajan's column has been sort of outdoors for this period of time, that actually a lot of the detail on that is no longer at the same level as is preserved on these casts. So instead, it's sort of the different value and the different perspective that these casts present is not to say that this necessarily transcends or is better than the original, but that it provides something different. It provides an alternative perspective for visitors, and it's something that has changed value and changed meaning over time. So when I think as curators, if we're ever sort of unsure about having interventions into objects, it's not that I'm standing here saying, hey, let's not preserve and collect video games, but also that we need to think about what those objects are and what aspects of them we need to potentially consider. Because, again, sort of if video games are performances, we need to think about how we can capture these performances now, because if we turn these video games on sort of in 100 years and we don't necessarily have the literacy or skills to be able to play those, and equally if we haven't resolved the issues of display, then actually we find ourselves with a whole amount of history that has potentially been lost. And so, lastly, like, when looking at that exit, when looking at Bloodborne, like I used to make all these statements of like, well, the game's 48 hours long, so we can't possibly put the whole game in there because people aren't going to spend that long in an exhibition space, and we can't have all these people playing the game because it's too complicated within this context. But one of the things that I did sort of last year, I think it was in early 2018, was me and my friend V went to see Christian Marclay's The Clock at the Tate. And if you're not familiar, this is a 24-hour film. And what happens in this film is that you get all these different clips from films which either reference clocks or reference time in somehow. It plays out in real time. And it's strange because when you're watching this film, you do find yourself with an urge to check your watch to see what the time is. And it's like, hey, it's on the screen in front of you. It's 2 a.m. But it's a 24-hour piece, and when this is exhibited, predominantly institutions find ways of being able to show this at different points for 24 hours. And me and V went to go and see The Clock. We went at 9 o'clock at night, and we left at 10 o'clock the next morning. We were really thankful to find out that the curators had thought about how people would be able to take bathroom breaks, and you got a bathroom pass. But we had also made sure that we didn't drink too much water before we went in, so we could stay as long as possible. But ultimately, we sat in that space for 13 hours. It's not traditionally thought of that is the way that your engagement, or the way that you're going to necessarily experience an art gallery or a museum. And so I think the thing that sort of made me realize is that all of these ways that I'm still considering or still thinking about the constraints of how we can exhibit video games, and thinking about sort of the way that this installation breaks sort of perhaps our conceptions of what curators should do or what museums do, that I don't think it's enough. I think we should be doing more, and I think we should allow ourselves to be a lot more playful and a lot more experimental in our approaches. And I think that's what's really great about the opportunity that we're afforded now, that the curatorial languages for video games haven't yet been defined. I can stand here and talk about my ideas and my approaches, but I think as we have sort of hopefully a greater range of people working curatorially in this space, as we have more institutions engaging with this subject, that there will be more people to experiment with different ways of considering how we might exhibit and display that medium, which in turn might impact or affect sort of the way that we consider preserving it, or the way that we might consider archiving it. So as I say, video games break in museums, so let's use video games to break museums. Thank you. Oh no.
Wow. That was tremendous. That was just lovely.
As long as that was relatively coherent?
Yes, I think it was
profoundly
coherent. Do you know if Victoria and Albert played games?
Oh yeah, they were big fans of From Software. So,
but what would they have played? Whist or something? I don't know.
I have no idea. Okay. We'll find some historians.
That's the only question I got.
Henry Cole, yeah.
Yes. What is the mission of the Victoria and Albert Museum? Is there a larger?
Yeah,
mission for them?
Yeah, so it's something that there is sort of like a curatorial sort of statement for the institution laid out that that it is primarily an institution of design and one that sort of says that it's interested in design process. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's an institution that also exhibits and collects performance. It also collects and exhibits photography, which perhaps are sort of materials or sort of mediums which exist outside of that. But it's interesting sort of that the museum sort of says, I guess, sort of what its focus is about, sort of communicating and educating people about design and presenting new different perspectives and about those and opening up those subjects. But it's interesting to note sometimes the way that message is there, but sometimes the processes and the hierarchy and the strategies and even just sort of the procedures and the documents that you have as an institution drive you towards this quite reductive sort of perspective of, oh, this is actually about sort of collecting objects and putting objects into a space, rather than perhaps sort of reflecting back on actually what is the core message or core motivation of what we're doing.
And this show was put together over the course of many years, 4 or 5 years, something like that?
So I worked for it for sort of 3 years. It was in sort of development. It had sort of a brief hiatus, but before that as well, there was years where it went round sort of the washing machine of sort of the hierarchy of getting approvals. So that has even sort of a lifespan before I started working on it.
Can you give us a glimpse of what the sort of process was like? Did you have a board of directors that you had to respond to? Was there another, like a lead curator that was overseeing this that you had to answer to?
So the sort of process was that the exhibition, so the department that I'm based within at the V&A is the Design, Architecture and Digital Department. And so a lot of the way that department operates and a lot of its priorities were very sort of influential on the exhibition. So exhibitions at the V&A will primarily normally be sort of under the sort of watch of the research department, but they'll normally be connected out to a department that has sort of like a specialism. So if it's a fashion exhibition, it'll be connected to the fashion team. So in terms of, so there was also sort of, we have sort of department keepers who are people who will sort of provide guidance and overview of exhibitions and sort of provide support for their development. And also you have sort of the senior management as well in the exhibition steering group, which is the very senior people who you sort of have to go to this very, very fancy room with all of this sort of dark wooden paneling and sit down and present within like about 5 minutes, like, this is all the work that we've done in the past year, like, say it's okay. So, yeah.
Was there ever any conflict in that context of you showing video games? Anybody raised eyebrow or popped monocle?
The music. That's how everybody dresses. Everybody's got monocles at the museum, and like leather patches. It's something that I get asked a lot is in terms of how supportive the institution was for the medium, and I think the battle about whether or not the institution was going to do an exhibition on video games was one that was already fought before I arrived. And I've always been sort of amazed by how supportive the institution was, or how, I don't know if the word's naive, but the fact that they were sort of quite happy to let me lead on the exhibition and just like, are you sure that I know what I'm doing? Am I allowed to do this? And so it was always an institution that was very supportive of the medium, but not one where, say, unlike a subject like architecture, there's many different people at the institution who will be sort of experts, who will come from that background. Yeah. And so I think the thing that I was always very conscious of is that whilst it was a supportive institution, that I was always a bit scared that it's like, is this being interrogated? Do people have the same confidence to critique and comment on this in the same way they would perhaps areas or fields where they perhaps feel that they've got more confidence engaging with?
Mm. And how did you get so good at this? Because you were co-founder of Wild Rumpus, but it's a very different context, putting together Wild Rumpus. The level of thoughtfulness and kind of a scholarly acumen and the kind of the process that you went through, the kind of intellectual rigor of thinking through these ideas, how did you develop that? Like, did you have inspiration that you were looking at? Were there mentors you were working with? How'd you get so good?
Well, thank you. I don't know, like, I think I almost feel sometimes like, and I don't want to be undermining myself, like, but
I just feel like at the moment, because there's been so few exhibitions on this subject, that it feels like there's just so much space to cover. And so it feels sort of like everything you're doing is like, wow, look, we're undertaking sort of something radical and different here. And so I feel partly that sort of part of that maybe comes from, actually, there's a lot of territorial ground to sort of cover here, but like obviously, sort of Harun Faruqi's installation is something that was inspirational for me. But also, I guess sort of coming from Rumpus sort of helped me consider what it means to put interactive objects into public spaces. But obviously, there's been sort of a huge learning curve that I've undergone sort of over the 4 years at the V&A, and equally now with the fellowship that I'm doing, that I feel like I'm going about it sort of back to front, that I don't come from an academic or a museum background. And so I've gone through this period of sort of, I guess, sort of practical work, and then come out the other end, and now it's like, great, now go to New York and have 6 months to sort of think about what you're doing. And so it's given me time to sort of read up on sort of more theory and to contextualize it and realize, oh, thank God, some of the conclusions that I've come to are conclusions that other people have come to in other fields or other areas. And it's great reading the work of, say, Beryl Graham and Sarah Cook, who have done an awful lot of work about considering the complexities of exhibiting new media art. And so you realize that actually, perhaps sometimes when I've not been necessarily embedded into that theory, that you take that perhaps from the world around you and from different exhibitions. And video games is not the only complex medium to exhibit, that there's, again, sort of new media art, there's architecture, there's performance, all of these other mediums that find themselves sort of very complicated within institutional spaces.
Yeah, I was watching you talk through the design process for the cleric battle, the video of the hands on the controller, and it made me think of the work of Graham Kirkpatrick, who's a philosopher who writes about video games and aesthetics, and who talks about how the dance of the thumbs is this sort of under-theorized and sort of hidden and unobserved aesthetic dimension of video games. And my God, there you have it. Like, it's amazing to go from something, I mean, no disrespect to these other exhibitions like Game On or something, but there's no comparison between the sort of cutout of Sonic the Hedgehog that is kind of emblematic of that approach, and the work that you are doing to kind of reveal it. And it made me think of not only the challenge of showing video games in a museum, but really what you're also doing is the challenge of software, like of interactivity as a designed object in a museum. Is this the first time? Like, because there's a digital component to the stuff V&A shows, but this approach, which emphasizes the kind of designed aspect of software as culture, is that kind of a brand new thing?
So there have been exhibitions at the V&A on digital design and artwork before. So there was Decode, which was an exhibition curated by Louise Shannon, but there was also The Future Starts Here, which was an exhibition that was looking at sort of future design, and so there were aspects of that were looking at digital design. But I think for the V&A, this is the first sort of show that has been dedicated to digital design. And I think exactly as you say, that sort of the lessons and the considerations that for me sort of whilst my specialism is in video games, that for me this applies to digital design, and it applies to a lot of interactive design. And there are other curators and other exhibitions which have sort of considered that or are dealing with that and thinking about sort of how do you present sort of how do you really truly communicate interactive objects and interactive works within public spaces.
Yeah. When I'm feeling a little cynical, I think sometimes about the relationship between video games and museums, because there are many shows, many exhibits, and I think of it kind of transactionally, right? That there is something that video games have that museums want, and there's something museums have that video games want. What video games have that museums want is a kind of thriving pulse of energy, that is a living culture that people are passionate about and care about and get excited about. And what museums have that video games want is status, a kind of cultural cachet, a seriousness, Was that ever on your mind? Did you ever feel that kind of transaction happening?
Yeah, I think
putting the show together.
You definitely feel that tension, and I think it's why I used to be, and shame on me, sort of a lot more cynical about sort of past exhibitions. I've been sort of like, this is like Super Mario. This is not the only sort of ambassador that we should have for this cultural medium, but it's a great ambassador, but now, sort of having been through that space, I think it's like, okay, well, it was incredibly rare to have an institution that was prepared to allow us sort of this very sort of experimental and different approach to exhibiting video games, because I think that from the museum's perspective, that it's very, and I think it's especially at a point in time when a lot of museums are really sort of aware of the fact that they are competing with other types of media. The museums are in competition with video games for sort of free time, as well as sort of immersive experiences or theme parks and entertainment. And I think, and it's something that, so Michael McMaster, who was a research fellow in the exhibition, is doing sort of a PhD on this and spoke sort of eloquently on it. And he stayed with the exhibition and did sort of a lot of research on that through its final stages. And he was talking about the fact, when he's talked to me about sort of the research and what he's observed, that there is this potential, I guess sort of, that temporary exhibitions are commercial, that this is sort of an aspect of, this is a sort of commercial proposition in part for institutions and for museums. And because of that, there is sort of this easy sort of, potentially easy mistake to make of thinking video games, immersive, interactive, fun, kids, different demographic to we normally have. So if we put sort of lots of playable games in here, then that automatically does that thing that we're looking to do. And so it's a fight as well to sometimes say, know that it's very easy for us to potentially want to create these arcades and to want to focus on popular works, but it's not actually, I think, what, for me, I want to use institutional museums for. It's like, this is not for me about putting video games in a cultural elevator and bringing them up to, it's sort of instead about like, no, this is a space where we can interrogate and look at this from different perspectives, and that's what we should be taking from this and being able to show these connected histories. But the space that institutions and the space that the V&A shows its hand is in the gift shop. All the exhibition, all the way through the exhibition design, we're like, no pixels, no cliches, no like, sort of like 8-bit sort of like, oh, it's all in 8-bit, that's computer games, kids. And so it's this all sort of very contemporary design. We worked with a wonderful, wonderful sort of 3D design studio called Pernilla Årstedt. And then you get into the exhibition shop, and that's obviously where sort of the most transactional you're going to get in the museum. Suddenly, oh, this is where the pixels are. This is where sort of, the thing that depressed me most was they had cans of beer in the shop, and it was Beavertown. When I asked them why, they were like, well, the cans of beer have got illustrations on them, and video games have illustrations in them. I was like, I don't think that's why. And they had beer socks as well, so like for men only. But so it's like, oh, this is where we're sort of showing our hand a little bit. But yeah, there's parts of development at this exhibition where there were some changes over of senior staff. And so I think sometimes I'm like, partly because of the but because of the unfamiliarity with the subject that perhaps allowed us to fly under the radar a little bit. Sometimes the changeover of senior staff maybe allowed us to fly under the radar a little bit, or maybe they were just incredibly supportive, but just not in the gift shop.
It's so wonderful what you did. I think the museum is, I think, inherently a conservative institution. And it is a place where we as a culture decide what's important enough to preserve, to explain, to showcase. And I think that the way that you did it in this exhibition is deeply inspiring, and it's wonderful, and it kind of I'm torn a little bit, because sometimes I think that games are unruly and difficult and squirrely, and they won't sit still, and you can't hang them on the wall, and you can't put them on the shelf, and it's all the things you draw, and yet, I'm always in favor of letting that kind of untamed energy run wild and not attempting to domesticate it and to tame it. But in a weird way, watching this and seeing the thought process and it is important to harness that energy sometimes, Taming that energy is valuable, right? And so there is something, I love the way you talk about allowing these games to break the museum in a positive way, and it's kind of a beautiful Tai Chi move, right? By not forcing them into the standard modes that a museum is comfortable with, by kind of backing up and letting them be themselves, you have I think, really shown the way for how to do this in these kinds of institutions.
But I think, and it's been a huge privilege to be able to have that opportunity, and I'm always really conscious of sort of the privilege that I had of being able to get to a situation or a position where I was able to be brought in. But I think also it's important for me to sort of, and I do sort of contextualize that within sort of speaking about it, is that this is obviously one way of approaching video games within the context of the V&A and in the context of sort of a V&A sort of headline exhibition. But again, sort of, I'm really sort of so happy about the different ways that people are approaching this and considering it, like the work of Baby Castles or of Wonderville or of Wild Rumpus, and I think it's a time for experimentation. And I think just as much as the medium squirrely doesn't want to sit still, like our exhibitions and our modes of curation shouldn't, but and I think it's something that I think within the V&A that I've had to, and I'm still sort of unpacking, is sort of what it means to do this work within an institution such as this, which, as you rightly say, very conservative and has sort of huge sort of colonial issues. And so, as I think sort of within both of those spaces, there's a lot of stuff which I think about when we sort of take for granted, when we look at the mission statement of work, like I always sometimes like. And I'm aware that sort of the opening quote that we have for the exhibition is a quote from Frank. We obviously have like a lot of, which I took out of the exhibit or the presentation today and instead put that Dan Houser quote in. But I often talk about the fact that in terms of exhibiting video games, the reason why that quote was important for us was that it helps sort of break video games down to sort of their most fundamental. And I think it's something that I need to do and that we need to do more with museums, and thinking actually what are they at the most fundamental? Because I think for museums especially, when we don't challenge that, we don't question what the purpose or what the profile is, that we're also not unpacking all of this colonial and very conservative and sort of hugely problematic sort of issues that can come if we don't really challenge what it is that we're preserving and why and who we're communicating to. And I think it's a great medium and a great opportunity to be able to do that with. But
sometimes I think about this question within the context of video art, right? Which typically you don't show a film in a museum. And yet in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there developed this new language and this new format, which ultimately became its own art form, right, with its own kind of formal qualities. And if you think about the difference between, say, Nam June Paik, kind of more gimmicky and perhaps more focused on the machinery, and then like Bill Viola, right, who is an artist working within the conventions of this newly established form. Sometimes I think interactivity games could, in their intersection with museums, start to develop in the same direction. Do you ever get a glimpse of that? Do you ever think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I really hope so. I didn't talk through it so much with this, but sort of we did have interactive works within the exhibition, and I think it's something that for me. That is thinking that it's not just about how we use museums to sort of exhibit games that exist in perhaps sort of a different context, but it's understanding that exhibitions and public spaces are equally platforms and opportunities for games designers and artists working within this medium to create work for. But I think because video games is still seen sort of so isolated from those spaces, that there's this whole sort of cultural ecosystem and landscape and all of these nested reasons why so often that doesn't happen. And for me, that's what's really important about equally considering different modes of curation, is thinking this is not just about how do we fit sort of a work like Bloodborne, which is made for an entirely different context, work in this space, but also what does it mean when we open up this space to designers, and to think about how we might create different works for those spaces. And I think it's a really sort of great time to be able to do that. And we did have some interactive works and commissions within this space, but no, we didn't quite push that far enough for what I would like to do, and that's something I'd really love to be able to explore more.
Awesome. I want to open it up and see if there's any questions from the audience. Why don't we start here, and maybe I'll bring them up here.
Hey, I'm super curious. I'm fascinated to hear about your process designing for or curating for the V&A. How has that, or has it impacted your process designing for more ephemeral experiences like the parties and the installations and things? Like, what are you bringing from the more permanent curation into the more ephemeral?
We'll find out. I haven't done anything since the exhibition's closed. That the next thing that hopefully we'll be doing is doing Wild Rumpus again at GDC next year, which is obviously a while away. But there's definitely things that I will be taking from this, and I think for me it's that. I don't necessarily, this was never, like, doing this exhibition was never sort of my grand ambition of, like, I would love to do a big AAA exhibition in a museum, because that opportunity was one that I never thought would have existed. But I think on reflection, I would really love to be able to find the middle ground of, actually, and I know what my answer is that I think ultimately the thing that I would like to be able to have for those experience, or for that sort of curation, is just more time and more resources of, like, actually, I think sort of like probably like yourself and other sort of people who curate and produce sort of events in this medium, that because there's still so few resources and there's such a lack of sort of a support system around that work, that people are doing this at the fringes, people are doing this sort of outside of their day job, which is limiting for the amount of people that then can access and have the opportunity to curate, but also I think limits the potential of what we have the time to consider and develop. So I think the biggest thing that I would like to take from this is time. I don't quite know if I can stomach doing an exhibition of that scale again, because I don't ever want to think about where I'm going to be 5 years from now, but yeah, being able to find something that sort of sits in the halfway, but just having more time to be more considered and, yeah, more considerate about my approach.
Hi, yeah, I guess I'm just curious, like, where you draw the line between, like, curation and being a curator, and then, like, being like a contemporary artist, because I think in the last several...
You've crossed the line, Marie. You're not an artist. That's what somebody said to me at work the other day. They said, or not the other day, like a few months ago, is they said, that's your problem, Marie, is that you don't want to be a curator, you want to be an artist. And it's like, no, I really don't want to do that. But I think for me, the line that I draw in, it's something again that sort of Beryl Graham and Sarah Cook in their book Rethinking Curation, which if you're interested in that space is a really sort of amazing sort of text to read, is that they just talk about the fact that I think for me sort of working as a curator is not about necessarily being the authority. It's about being that hub of collaboration with different people. That for me, sort of the creation of that Bloodborne installation is not me sort of, and I know this is a gross generalization of the way that artists work as well, but for me it's about saying this is collaborative, that this is for me, the role of the curator is identifying sort of who the authorities are that we should be bringing together to present an object, and that it's identifying what skills and what different ways there are of creating that. And within the scope of the V&A exhibition, there wasn't, because it's such a machine of creating exhibitions at this scale, that I don't think in terms of collaborating with 3D designers and AV designers that we're able to be quite as collaborative as I wanted to. And that for me is something that I would like to continue, but it definitely blurs the line, and Beryl Graham and Sarah Cook talk about this with this idea of sort of curator as artist and artist as curator, and they talk about that specifically within sort of the new media landscape. But it's a blurry line, but then again, it sort of comes back to, for me, to this idea of actually we have to break conventions with this, that there is sort of examples of that happening previously, but if there's a bit of a blurry line there, then hey, let's just have fun and cross that. But no, I don't consider my sort of self working as an artist, and I don't particularly want to. But it gives me anxiety.
Yeah.
Thanks. Hello. I was just curious if you had any specific opinions or thoughts about emulators and their role in video game curation.
They serve a very critical role. They are good. With depending on sort of if you work as a archivist, if you're a collections curator, then yeah, in terms of preserving video games, that I think ultimately that we have to, all of conservation or all of curating, I guess, sort of in terms of collections, is about how do we slow time down, that we're like, how do we just keep everything forever? And the truth is we can't do that. For traditional objects or traditional sort of media objects like a piece of paper, that's going to be a lot slower, and we kind of know what happens to that over time, but we don't with digital design objects. So I think depending on what your motivation is, whether, as I say, I'm not a collections curator, so my personal focus is on the here and now rather than it is sort of looking to the future, but I think those areas are interconnected. But if you're somebody who's looking to collect and preserve games, then yeah, ultimately you're not going to be able to keep the same sort of perfect object X number of years from now. So whatever tools or ways that you have to preserve or capture what you've deemed as important, or whatever you want to keep of that, then that's an important role. So does that answer the question? Or were you happy with the good or bad at the beginning?
Yeah.
Hi, I was able to attend the show last fall, and I really was struck by just the way that you were able to understand sort of the emotional journey of the creator and the player. At least that's what stuck out to me. And so I was curious, now that you are a creator and curator in some ways, in a lot of ways, how are you tracking on new games, and how do you evaluate them, and are you kind of looking and kind of moving in a certain direction for a new show? And yeah.
At the moment, sort of, so the work that I'm doing at the moment is a fellowship with the Cooper Hewitt, and so a lot of what I'm having time to do now is sort of decompress and just sort of begin to contextualize and understand what we did within the exhibition. So a lot of that, it's been difficult for me from going from sort of 4 years working towards one very specific output or end goal, and then suddenly being like, hey, just go have some thoughts and just do some research. But I think it's really important for me at the moment, and I think in regards to the medium, that there is actually quite a rich history of exhibiting video games. Obviously, it's not necessarily as I guess sort of as, there isn't as much as, say, sort of a lot of other disciplines, but I think too often, again, sort of perhaps because of the lack of exhibitions, the lack of resources, that we don't necessarily discuss and share sort of a lot of the sort of theoretical approaches. And so that, for me, is sort of where my work is, but obviously in the back of my head, there's a lot of different sort of avenues that I would love to have the opportunity or the ability to explore. There's a lot of different ideas that I have, but I guess ultimately it's like, hey, who's got the money in the museum that's going to let me do that? So, yeah.
So as you're drawing the line between collecting and curating, I'm curious about the criteria you used for the initial game selection for the new, the first section of the exhibition, which I also was able to see, and it was great. How did you choose which games to showcase and what breadth to show?
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's not that I'm necessarily, for me, it's more about, for me, that I'm not a collections curator, that obviously some curators are sort of focused on collections, but yeah, oh good, how did we do that? I was so scared about when we sort of opened the door of the exhibition of how many people were going to sort of stand up and be like, where's Grand Theft Auto? It's like, I'm sorry, it's not here. But it was really hard that, as I say, the thesis of the exhibition was a specific time period, and that thesis was really about work which was enabled by that technology and those technological catalysts to sort of push the boundaries of the medium. So it was all supposed to be work that was doing something different, that was challenging our expectations. So that was one of the core fundamental things that each game had to aspire to. We didn't want a duplication of games within that space, so it was often less about necessarily the individual titles, but the way that they sort of spoke to each other or contrasted each other. So we didn't want to have sort of two games that were of the same genre, we didn't want to necessarily have two games at a different scale, and we wanted different games that sort of represented different design studios, different ambitions, and that told slightly different design stories. So for some of the games, it was perhaps more about the references or the influences on that work, so like Kentucky Route Zero, or for other games, it was a sort of a slightly different aspect. And so we had a list of around about 20 games, or probably even more than that at the beginning. But it was one about sort of the way that they complemented each other. It was how they fit into the thesis. But also critically, it was about it was also about sort of which games actually had the materials and the objects that we were able to display, that sadly some titles just, they haven't necessarily archived or preserved those works, or perhaps there was not necessarily ways at the moment that we could necessarily consider how we could exhibit that. So there had to be a weight of material available, and also critically we had to be confident and comfortable with our engagement with the design studio. And I guess for independent designers that means that we need to, that this is obviously still an ask of your time, and so who sort of has the capacity to be able to sort of work with us to dig out some old stuff from their archives, but also if we're speaking through a PR department, who do we feel really understands what we're trying to achieve with this exhibition and perhaps doesn't necessarily just see it as an expo marketing opportunity, which is inevitable that this is going to be promotion in some way. So there's a whole lot of complicated reasons and a whole lot of complicated reasons why Grand Theft Auto is not in the exhibition. But yeah, so it was sort of a whole range of different experiences. But ultimately as well, you're going to be biased if you're a curator, that you're going to lean towards certain works that I wouldn't love to say like, oh, we're all just impartial and apolitical. It's not true, we're all biased.
One more, I think we have time for one more question, yeah.
So I'm curious about what role does the audience play in this whole curating process? There might be a degree difference between different familiarity with the game, because although game is so popular now, but still it's not like other traditional media such as music or movies that literally everybody knows it and interacted a lot. Sometimes there are people who maybe don't play games at all. So do you think different audience will influence your decision making, or are they just the passive receivers of that information, or they play a role and do have some impact in the overall process?
Part of me as well would like to just be no, start the audience, I'm going to do some weird stuff, and if you get it, you get it, if you don't, you don't. But no, very, very much so. And as I said at the beginning, thinking about the fact that this exhibition, the context for this was at the V&A, that we're often asked to sort of define our audiences, and it was thinking, one, okay, this is about sort of not necessarily one sort of homogenized games audience, but sort of fragmented and different audiences who might be fans or very literate of specific genres or specific games. So we had sort of that sort of expert level of audience that we anticipated. There was, I guess, sort of this mid-tier of thinking, okay, but what about people who perhaps sort of casually enjoy games or enjoyed games sort of when they were younger, maybe they don't play as much, or people who are sort of relatively digitally literate, but perhaps just are creatively curious about the medium. And then lastly, there was this sort of idea of well, what about the traditional V&A sort of museum member who only understands sculpture? How do we communicate this medium to them? So it's hard, because I think within that you potentially run the risk of if you try and speak to all those audiences in the same way with every single object and every single installation, then you run the risk of sort of, I guess, ultimately saying nothing to anyone. So for us, it was thinking, so for a lot of the installations and a lot of the objects, it's something that our interpretation team used to pull us back to thinking about is, who does this speak to and at what level? And so, for example, when we're looking at the material, so we showed those very quick slides about some of the design materials and objects that we pulled together. And it's okay, if you're a very big fan of Bloodborne, you might go in and you might sort of engage with a specific object and learn more about that specific thing, get engaged with that. But if instead you stand back and look at those objects as a constellation, that even though you don't necessarily take away the depth of every single story or every single object that we have there, you understand something comprehensively about the different range of materiality and some of the different design processes that go into that. So it's something that we thought about a lot with this exhibition, of thinking, how does each object potentially speak to different people? How do they speak as a whole to different audiences? Equally with the language that we used, that we wanted to be true to the design language of video games, but also understanding that when we say something like AAA to one audience, that it might mean absolutely nothing to another. So if we use the word AAA, that we will also always after that put the word sort of blockbuster, just so it's okay, here's enough for you to understand. But I think I would also love to get to a point where exhibitions don't necessarily have to I think there's a lot of fear in institutions about sort of who does or doesn't understand the subject, which I think sometimes can potentially limit the depth and the focus that we can have in the subject. And I think sometimes in future for me, and again, coming back to this idea of what would I like to, I guess, sort of move forwards to, is not necessarily always trying to curate exhibitions that speak to everyone, but audience literacy and audience behavior is something that played a very sort of critical role in the development of this exhibition. And so the approaches to curation within that were very sort of specific to our considerations about the audiences in that venue.
I think there's something that happens when you pay a certain kind of attention to cultural work, attention that is so serious and smart and careful and thoughtful, that it becomes aspirational in a sense. I think in a way you literally elevate the thing that you're looking at. So it's not just a matter of understanding it and analyzing it and communicating it, and it actually makes it smarter, in a way. And I really think that for an art form or for a cultural form to thrive and evolve, it requires a literate audience. It requires a certain kind of critical literacy. And so I think you are actually making video games better by the work that you're doing, and make me as a game designer want to make work that is worthy of that attention and that kind of seriousness of thought and analysis. So I thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for coming tonight. And everyone, please, thank you, Marie Foulston.